On the very last day of creation, after God had created the entire world, the planets, the stars, the moons, the sun, earth, fish, birds in the sky, animals in the forest, after everything was complete, then God created man. But the Medrash explains to us not as an afterthought, not as something, well, let's add something to creation, but rather the reason for and the pivotal point of everything in creation. And the Medrash gives us a parable. They say, imagine the following. Imagine you invite a man to a meal. First, you prepare the meal, then you set the table, and only when everything is ready do you usher in your guest. So too, God put everything into its proper order, put everything into existence, and only when the world was complete, then God ushered in man, because man is the reason for creation, the reason for the animals, the birds, the stars in the sky, and therefore man was created last, much like the guest who's ushered in to a ready, prepared meal. And that measure seems to give us a perspective of man's place in the planet, man's place in the order of creation, but I believe that also should bring us to an interesting question. And that is that it sure does seem that God put many, many features into other parts of the world that man could have benefited from. Man could have had a better time here, an easier time in his existence, and clearly man wasn't given them. Let me give you an example. Let's go into the wild kingdom for a moment. If we study the wild kingdom, we'll find that there are many, many features that wild animals have that would benefit man in a tremendous way, yet they're clearly absent from man. Let's start with an example. I have a background in martial arts, and I remember when I was a young fellow, there was then a martial art practitioner, a very well-known fellow whose name was George Dillman. George Dillman was a pretty good martial artist, but probably a better showman, and George Dillman would put on demonstrations that were very well attended. First he began breaking wood, then bricks, and finally huge blocks of ice. And eventually George got to a point where he ran out of things to break. And he ran out of things to top his last show. So George decided that he was going to put on the ultimate karate demonstration. He was going to fight a bear. Now, obviously, he wasn't going to really fight a live bear, but he brought in a circus bear that had been trained. And together with the trainer, they choreographed the fight scene. The bear would swing wide, George would duck, George would punch. And they went through a whole choreographed fight scene, and the show was arranged. Well, George took himself seriously, and maybe a tad too seriously. George decided that he was not going to just go through the choreographed fight scene. The day of the fight, George decided he's going to knock the bear unconscious. Well, the crowd is drawn. George takes the stage. The trainer brings out the bear, and it's billed as the ultimate fight between man and beast. The trainer releases the bear, and they circle, and they begin going through the choreographed fight scene. The bear swings wide, George ducks, and George hauls off and smashes the bear full force in the chest. You could hear the thud 6 rows back. Well, needless to say, George did not knock the bear out. But George did manage to get the bear angry. So angry, in fact, that if the trainer hadn't jumped into the ring to stop the bear would have mauled George to death. And George learned an important lesson that day. You could be a high-ranking martial artist with 20 years of combat experience, but you can't fight a bear. A bear weighs 600 pounds, solid muscle, and man against beast, it just doesn't work. So here's the question. God created the bear with tremendous strengths. Why didn't God put man into just such a body? And why didn't God put me into a body that's huge, powerful, vigorous, so I wouldn't smash my shin, and I wouldn't hurt my elbow? Why didn't God make man much, much more powerful? Take the same essence of man, the same human personality, but put it into a body that's far more powerful. And if you don't hear this question, let me share with you another observation. It's a February evening, and you're shivering to the bone. You have layer upon layer upon layer. Nothing keeps the cold out. Strangely enough, the polar bear doesn't suffer much in the cold. Matter of fact, the polar bear will take its claw, cut open a hole in the ice, go in for a nice dip into the Arctic Sea, come out, shake its fur off, and sun itself in the minus 20 degree temperature. the bear doesn't shiver, because the bear has been coated with a layer of blubber, and the bear is very comfortable in its environment. Why didn't God make man bigger, stronger, with a thick coat to keep him warm so that man shouldn't suffer? And if you begin looking into the wild kingdom, you'll find many, many features that God clearly is capable of creating. God did create them, and God gave them out, but strangely enough, not to man. Let me share with you another example. The next time you're in the dentist's chair, and you have that powerful, horrible toothache, the wisdom tooth that your dentist tells you is going to have to be dealt with, I want you to think about the shark. The shark. Why the shark? Because that mighty hunter of the sea has 25 rows of teeth. If he has trouble with a tooth, pops out, and the next one comes in, fits itself in, and he's good to go. Why didn't God create man with 25 rows of teeth? So if I have a trouble with the incisor, with my molar, pop, it's gone, a new one comes in. And if you look about the wild kingdom, you'll see many, many features that God gave out, dispersed clearly, and didn't give to man. But if man is the reason for creation, if man is the pinnacle of it all, wouldn't you imagine that God would gather all these strengths, all these things, and give it to man, the reason for it all? And if you study what happens in our world, you'll quickly see that there are strange things going on. In the world that we live in, there are things known as diseases, illnesses, a stupefying immune system in man, but gaping holes that allow bacteria, viruses, diseases in. So here's an interesting observation. Michael Zasloff, a biochemist with the National Institute of Health, made a very interesting discovery. You see, he was working with the African clawed frog. He was in the jungle in these murky, disease-infected, bacteria-infested ponds. And while he was experimenting with the African clawed frog, he made an amazing discovery. The scientists would do various dissections. They cut off parts of the body, parts of legs often, and no matter what they did to these frogs, they put them back into the murky, bacteria-filled water, and the frogs never got diseased. They never succumbed to illnesses. And what Michael Zasloff discovered was that the African clawed frog has an immune system that produces an amazing substance. It secretes this white substance that kills every known form of bacteria. Being a Jewish fellow and a bit of an entrepreneur, he decided to patent it and to use it. But here's the point. God clearly is capable of stopping disease. He gave an immune system to the little African clawed frog that prevents all known types of illnesses from getting to it. Wouldn't man have benefited tremendously from that? Before the discovery of penicillin, probably the greatest killer of man was exactly that, bacteria. And certainly viruses and certainly diseases. But if God is wise enough to create an immune system in the African clawed frog, a secretion that kills every known bacteria, why didn't God put that into man? And if you begin thinking about things, you'll begin to discover that there are certain things that man is lacking, and it almost looks like it's by design. Let me share with you another example. Science now tells us that much of our moods are directly affected by the neurotransmitters in our brain, the levels of serotonin, dopamine, adrenaline. And you could affect that in various ways. Obviously, medications will affect your moods, but even simple things like exercise. Good, strong, vigorous exercise will bring a certain change in the neurochemistry. Runners know it as runner's high. After about 45 minutes of vigorous running, the body starts responding, and either then or shortly thereafter, the athlete experiences a mild sense of euphoria, or just a sense of, wow. Now here's the observation. What is happening in that athlete? The body is secreting certain chemicals. The thalamus, that part of the brain that's receptive to them, receives it, sends back the message of, ah. So why didn't God just make the thalamus more receptive, make the glands that secrete these chemicals more productive, and man could be happy all day long? Imagine the following. Imagine that I had a bit more of an active secretion gland. In the morning I get up, I stretch my arms, and a dose of the neurotransmitters come across me. Whoa! I take my first drink of orange juice. Woo! Another mild wave of euphoria comes over me. Clearly God has the capacity to create this. Why didn't he give it to man? Why didn't he place in man a much different state of neurotransmitters so that man can be happy, blissful all day long? And when you begin studying the way that God did create man, you should ask many, many questions. Why did God put so many features in the world and not give them to man? And why are there many features in man that does man no good whatsoever? And let's focus on one particular one because it may be more obvious than others. If you've ever experienced a stomach ache, you'll note that it's very different than a toothache, different than a muscle ache, different than a headache, bit different than when one of your internal organs are bothering you. When you stub your toe, it hurts. And when you smash your shin, it hurts. But the hurts are very different. And if you begin studying pain, you'll quickly realize that there are vast differences in pain. Totally different types of pains. There are burns, there are scrapes, there are breaks. You could almost write poetry about the different types of pain that man experiences. And when you focus on the fact that almost none of it does man any good, none of it benefits man, none of it makes man happier in his stay in the planet, the question you should ask is, why would a kindly, giving, loving creator put so much effort so that man should suffer? Clearly a lot of wisdom went into the delivery system. Clearly a lot of forethought went into the plan of it, all for me to say, ow, and feel pain. Why do it? And at the risk of being irreverent, I'd like to posit that if I were given the job of creating man, I would do a far better job than did God. In fact, imagine with me the following. Imagine that one day I hear a loud voice from heaven. Shaffier, yeah. I was sent to tell you. What? I was sent to tell you, you think you can do a better job? God says, go ahead, you make man. Oh my goodness. I was given a mandate. I was given a mandate to create man. Let's go. I would search the wild kingdom and take all of the strengths. My man would be as powerful as a bear, an immune system like the African clawed frog. My man would be able to go for weeks like the camel without water. He'd be as energetic as an ant, perfect hearing like the bat. My man, whoa, what a huge gland secreting those neurotransmitters all day long, euphoria. I would make a superman, a man who wouldn't get diseased, a man who wouldn't get tired, a man who wouldn't get fatigued. But not just that. What about anger? Not in my man. Anger hasn't benefited mankind at all. Get that part out. What about arrogance, conceit? Not in my man. No way. It hasn't helped mankind at all. Jealousy? Gone. Greed? Forget about it. Laziness? I would make man in a very different way than God did. And my man would be happy as a lark, with energy, with strength, with power, health, robust vitality. I would make a superman. So here's the question. If God created all of those features, clearly God is capable of putting them into man. And the question that begs being asked is, why did God create man as God created him? This man who's powerful, yet so fragile. This man who's so independent, yet so dependent. Why did God create man in the form and the fashion that he did? And if in fact we understand that everything in creation was put there for man's good, and we understand that God wants mankind's benefit, the question we have to ask is, what does God intend? Why did he do it? What did he have in mind? And I'd like to share with you another area of question. And to do that, I'd like to share with you a distinction that most people don't seem to make. There's a very clear distinction that most people sort of gloss over and in their existence sort of just seem to be oblivious to. There is in the world something called pleasure, and there is in the world something called passion or desire. And the two are very, very different. Let me share with you what I mean. Imagine that you're shipwrecked. You're on the boat, and the boat collapsed, and you find yourself shipwrecked on an island. Not a soul there. Nothing. And it's day after day. On the third day, you're famished. You're thirsty. You haven't eaten in days. You haven't been so hungry in your life, and you're looking up and down the island. Finally, under a tree, you see a bag. Oh my God, a brown bag. You open it, and inside is a crusty peanut butter sandwich that's been sitting in the sun for 6 months. You wolf it down faster than you ate anything in your entire life. Now, here's the question. When you ate that peanut butter sandwich, were you hungry? Oh, I better believe you are. Did you eat it with a lot of desire? You sure did. Did you get much pleasure from that activity? For the rest of your life, do you think you're going to be reminiscing about, the crackling of the bread as it scratched my palate, the acrid, pungent taste of the bitter peanut butter as it kind of scratched on the way down? I doubt you would derive much pleasure at all. A lot of desire, a lot of passion, but very little pleasure. And this distinction between pleasure and passions gets man into an awful lot of trouble and makes for a lot of wrecked lives. Let me share with you a very interesting example of it. If you speak to someone who's addicted to chemicals, to alcohol, whatever it may be, and ask them to describe the first time they got high. Whoa, it was astonishing. It was amazing. A better experience than I ever had in my life. Okay, that was the first time they got high. But now that they're addicted, now that they can't stop, ask them to describe the pleasure that they derive from the activity. Most of the time, if you'll ask an alcoholic, ask a drug addict how much pleasure they get, the answer is very little. In fact, it's much more like a state of disaster. I desperately crave it. I desperately need it. But not only don't I want it, I don't even enjoy it anymore. I need another drink, and I know that another drink might mean the end of my life, and I can't say no. When you hear people describe themselves chained to the bottle, chained to the drugs, what you're listening to is a person who's suffering in an amazing manner. Not a person who's enjoying, not a person who's, wow, I'm loving it. A person who's still doing it, but doing it because they're bound and held by powerful needs and powerful desires. Very little pleasure, but a whole lot of desire. So here's the next question. Why in the world would God have created man in his very strange sort of state, where pleasure is one thing, and desire is another, and many times you could get involved in things that look pleasurable, but sure don't bring you much joy, and as a matter of fact, wreck your life. Why make man that way? It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And to fully understand what I'm asking here, I want to share with you one more step in this example. You ever hear the expression, the average man thinks he's smarter than the average man? So all of us know that money doesn't buy happiness. But again, because culturally we're so inundated with it, and culturally we're so swamped with that idea, let's imagine for a minute the following. Let's imagine that I get a chance to be wealthy. But I don't mean commonly wealthy, not a couple of million. I win it big. $365 million cash. I won the largest lotto in history. Wow. Now look, let's imagine for a minute, all my life, all I've wanted to do is pursue pleasure. And let's imagine that I, as many people assume, the only reason why I'm not really having as much pleasure as I could in life is because I don't have enough money. I mean, if I had more money, I'd have more pleasure, right? More money is more pleasure, more money than that. It'd be great. Well, now I've arrived. Imagine I'm there, $365 million. I could spend it however I want, and now I can go out at what I'm looking for in life, the pursuit of pleasure. Let's imagine that I'm a hedonist. My whole focus in life is the pursuit of pleasure, and I now have the means to accomplish just that. Let's sort of pay attention to the unfolding. So what do? This is it. I made it. 365 million is great. First thing I do is I buy my private island in the Pacific. I hire my team of butlers, maids, and of course chefs. Mediterranean for the evening, French chef for the afternoon meal, Italian cuisine for breakfast, and I set up my island exactly as I want. And I plan my first breakfast. It's going to be phenomenal. Belgian waffles with maple syrup imported from Vermont. Milk only from Hereford cows, please. And of course, topped with whipped cream in the finest manner. And I'm ready. The first morning, I sit down. The white glove maitre d' ushers me into my private dining room. The waiter pulls out the chair. I sit down. He puts it in. And the waiter brings my Belgian waffles and sets it down right in front of me. Of course, covered, because it has to come to me exactly at the temperature that it came off the griddle. Heaven forbid it should cool. And I sit down to my first bite. And imagine the fact that the chef really is quite skilled. And imagine the fact that I do bite into it, and it's delicious. It's phenomenal, better than anything I've ever tasted in my life. And I take a second bite. Wow, the flavors, the aromas, the texture, it's unbelievable. I take a third bite and a fourth bite. And suddenly I discover something very interesting. What I discover is that the sizzle is a lot better than the steak. You see, yes, the first bite was really great, and the second bite was okay, but by the third bite already, it's, well, all right, and by the fourth, I'm not even paying attention, and I make that major discovery. You ever notice when they run the ads for restaurants, they show the tss as the steak just hits the griddle? Why don't they show you the prepared steak? Because Madison Avenue well knows that the sizzle is far better than the steak. The anticipated pleasure sure does sound much better than the actual pleasure. And what I discovered that day is the first rule of pleasure. The first rule of pleasure is that every pleasure is over-promised and under-delivered. Imagine the greatest pleasure you've ever dreamt of. And the build-up, the anticipation. It's going to be great. It's going to be better than that, better. Okay, it's good, but I mean, that's what people are killing themselves. That's what it's worth getting knocked out for. And suddenly I discover the first rule of pleasure. The first rule of pleasure is the build-up is always better than the delivery, and the sizzle's better than the steak. But listen, I'm a hedonist. I'm a pleasure seeker. I'm not giving up, so I continue eating, and I order seconds even. And I tell the waiter, bring me thirds and fourths. And after 15 minutes of really gorging and really enjoying to the fullest, I suddenly make another discovery. I can't eat anymore. I'm stuffed. I mean, I ate 5 thick Belgian waffles with whipped cream, maple syrup. I'm stuffed to the gills. I cannot eat another morsel. And I make the second discovery of the rules of pleasure. And that is that every pleasure has a limit. 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and then you're done, toast. You cannot eat anymore. You can't do whatever it is you're doing anymore. Every pleasure has a limit, and the time limit on the actual pleasure, if you carefully pay attention, you'll see, usually isn't that long. So if the first rule of pleasure is that every pleasure is over-promised and under-delivered, the second rule of pleasure is that every pleasure has a limit. But listen, I am not giving up. I have been pursuing pleasure my whole life. And the only reason I couldn't have it is because I didn't have money. But now I got money, and I am not giving up so fast. So I set myself out on my major tour. I am going to party and enjoy life. Okay. So I go about my day, plan my day, bungee cord jumping off the Eiffel Tower. Oh, I don't know, maybe then to Paris to go look at the museums. And I prepare myself for a beautiful day. I go about my day and come back to my private island by water ski because that's how I prefer traveling. And I come back and lie down in bed. Of course, I have to go to sleep early because if I don't get a good night's sleep, I'll be cranky next day. I can't really enjoy myself. I can't have full pleasure if I'm cranky and tired. If I lose an hour's sleep, I'll be who knows what. So I put myself into bed early and get up the next day fresh and ready to start my second day of pure pleasure seeking. Let's go. I tell the waiter, those Belgian waffles yesterday, they were great. Do it again. Exactly as you did it yesterday. So we do the same routine. The white glove maitre d' ushers me in. Waiter pulls out the chair. I sit down. The waiter brings by, takes the cover off, and there they are, as perfect, as luscious, as crisp as yesterday. I take my knife and fork. I cut in and prepare myself for the anticipated pleasure. I bite in, and they're good. They're really good. But you know something? I think they were better yesterday. Wait, come here. And they tasted better yesterday. Did the chef change the recipe? No. Did he do something different? No. Bring me another one. So the chef brings me another one, brings it out himself. I bite into it. And again, it tastes good. It tastes okay, but not quite as good as yesterday. And I discover the third rule of pleasure. The third rule of pleasure is the first time is the best time, but there's only one first time. The first time you bite into a steak, the first time you've ever eaten that type of dish, it's delicious beyond description. You can't even think of words to describe the pleasure that you have. But that first time is exactly that first time. It's unique. It's special. The second time, it'll still taste good. It'll still taste nice. But the first time is the best time and is only one first time. And now I'm beginning to get a little bit upset because my whole life, all I dreamt was pleasure, and I discovered all these rules. I mean, first of all, there's a limit to every pleasure, and second of all, they're all built up more than they are, and worse than that. I mean, there's only one time that's really the most phenomenal, amazing thing, but there's no second time that's as good. And I'm beginning to get a little bit bothered by these rules. But I'm not giving up. So I set about cruises, and I decide to plan my jet skiing, and I plan all of the various things that I'm doing, and I go, first off, I need a vehicle. I go into the BMW showroom. I buy one in every color of the rainbow. I hire my private limousine driver, and I'm experiencing pure pleasure. And as I go off on my carefree life of pleasure and enjoyment, somewhere along the line, I discover something very, very interesting. What I discover is that every pleasure is something that I had. Yesterday, I had a great time. It was amazing. Yesterday, I went skiing for the first time. It was awesome. I had a blast. I went to a new part of the world. I had a great time. And the fourth rule of pleasure is every pleasure is something that you had and you have nothing left of it. And what happens to me after a month or after 2 months is I suddenly discover something very, very interesting. Pleasures leave me empty. They're nice, they're fine, they're wonderful, but they leave me empty. They're things that I had but have no longer. I had a great vacation. I had a great time, but there's nothing left. And I feel empty, I feel lacking, and I begin to realize something is very funny going on in this thing called the human. Why did God make me this way? The drives and desires, that those drives and desires don't correlate directly to pleasure. Rules to pleasure that are so limited, pleasure that's so fleeting and passing. Why did God make the human in the way that God did? And the Mesilas Yesharim, the Path of the Just, says something so profound, powerful, yet obvious. He says that any thinking person, when studying the human condition, will quickly understand that God could not have created man for his station in this world alone. Because if man was created for his position, for his station in this world alone, then God did a terrible job creating so many features in man that didn't need to be there, not putting in so many things that should have been there, these urges, these desires, these strange needs, and yet they leave me empty. And if I pursue them, I'm caught up. And if I don't, I'm left in what is going on? And if you begin to study the human, what you begin to understand much more clearly is that God has a very clear plan for mankind. Every pleasure that God created has a purpose, and we're supposed to use them. But you see, God created us for a major reason, major purpose, and it's not to fill my belly, nor to make money, nor to write the next best novel in the world. God created me for accomplishments, for growth, to change myself. And every pleasure that a person has the opportunity to have in the world has a very real purpose. But you see, the purpose is to allow man to serve better, to allow man to accomplish more, and to give a human being a sense of relaxation, a sense of enjoyment, so that then he could go about his mission in a better way. And it's a very funny thing. When a person uses his life properly, he has a sense of calm, equilibrium, happiness, inner joy. And he enjoys this world in a much greater way. The world itself provides him a huge amount of pleasure. And I want to share with you an example that is so, maybe in our world, difficult to understand, but so obvious when you understand the human being. One of the rules in the Torah is that when a man and a woman get married, there's a concept called family purity. Family purity means that for 2 weeks out of the month, there's no physical touching. The woman is in a state of nida. Husband and wife are not allowed to touch. Not just that they're not allowed to have intercourse, not allowed to hug, not allowed to kiss. And when you explain to a young bride, a young groom, that this is the state of being, that for the rest of your married life, there'll be 2 weeks on and 2 weeks off, they look at you, what are you, crazy? That's impossible. That's horrible. And here's the question. Why would a kindly, loving, giving God create such barbaric, archaic, nasty rules? You can't touch your own wife. I'm not talking about another woman. I'm not talking about something forbidden. Your own wife. A wife can't touch her husband. A husband can't. Why? It sounds ludicrous. It sounds ridiculous. Why would God institute such laws? And would you like to understand the reason? I'll give you a very simple exercise. Find me any bride's picture. Find me any picture of any bride on her wedding day. And I challenge you to find a frown on her face. You won't find it. Every bride, as she walks down the aisle, her radiant glow, happiness, joy, she knows in her heart that she's deeply in love, and the love will carry them forever. She's embarking on life with joy and happiness, deep love for her groom. And here's the interesting observation. Currently, in the United States of America, divorce rate is 50%, often within a few years, often not that. But kind of what happened? Like, why is it that they both walk down the aisle with such happiness, such joy, such anticipation, and then a couple of months later, they're pulling each other's hair out. They're almost killing each other, and they separate well before death do us part. Now, there are many factors that function in this. Some of it is simply not knowing what it means to be married, not knowing gender differences. Some of it is based on selfishness and self-centeredness. Some of it is based on emotional inabilities to really put another person's needs first. There are many, many issues. And I deal with hundreds of couples, and I'm well aware of the issues that will affect the marriage. But I'd like to share with you that, again, of the hundreds of couples that I deal with on a regular, ongoing basis, many, many times the marriage disintegrates not because they're selfish, not because they have different life goals, not because there are financial issues or mother-in-law issues or anything of the like. They just start going different ways. They just start parting directions. They just start being in different worlds. They share the same house, but not the same life. They share the same children, but they as a couple are no longer connected, no longer bonded. And I'd like to share with you that if there isn't a bond of love in your marriage is doomed. Because it is very, very rare to find a human being of such absolute purity of heart that if he doesn't love his wife or the wife doesn't love the husband, that they can live together in peace and harmony. The glue of a marriage is that love. Obviously, it's the commitment. Obviously, it's being aligned in life. But what keeps things moving is the love in the marriage. And I'd like to share with you one more observation that may not be so obvious in our time. There are different tools that God created so that a husband and a wife should be bonded together. Romantic love is built with attention, with looking into his other's needs, seeing what I can do for my wife and the wife for the husband, and spending quality time together. And that's a big part of the success of a marriage, romantic love. Appreciation is certainly a big part of a successful marriage and a love in a marriage. Respect is certainly a big part of it. But I'd like to share with you, there's another part to a successful marriage. God created a certain physical attraction of a man to a woman to a man. It's a sexual attraction that is imperative, that is vital for the success of a marriage. It helps build the bond of love. It helps build that connection. And when a husband and wife come together, there's a rejoining, a reconnecting. And let me share with you something profound. It's a Mishnah. Rabbi Meir tells us the reason why God instituted the laws of Nida. Why is it that a couple should be on 2 weeks and off 2 weeks? That once a month a wife should come back to her husband as a bride comes to her groom. You see, when you separate for 2 weeks and there's no touching, there's no embracing, there's no hugging, obviously there's no sexual contact, there's a difference in your relationship. There's a sort of changing, a waxing and a waning. Yes, you are a little bit physically apart, but there's a different sense in the balance of the relationship. And suddenly a husband will look at his wife with more of an appetite. A wife will look at her husband with different sort of eyes. And as the days pass and the weeks pass, there's a difference in the communication. They relate to each other differently. And after the 2 week period, when they come together, it's a beautiful reunion. A reunion that creates and fosters that bond of love, attachment, that helps them continue in the long course of life. Astonishingly, many marriage therapists, secular marriage therapists, when a couple comes to them with trouble, one of the first recommendations they have is try separating for 2 weeks. What? Try separating for 2 weeks? That's a Torah con. Yeah. Try separating for 2 weeks, because what you'll find is that when something's too accessible, too available, it no longer has the same allure, no longer has the same desire, and it sort of loses its appeal. Separate for a while, and then when you come back to the new appetite, a new desire. And if you begin studying the human, you'll find something profound. God created the human to succeed. And God gave us a Torah, the guidebook, how to lead a successful life. And when you follow the systems, you lead a meaningful, purposeful life, and you enjoy life in a very real way. Many times couples will tell you things get stale. I don't know, do you keep the laws of Nida? No. But it gets stale. Why does it get stale? I don't know. We're just always together. I don't appreciate her. She doesn't appreciate me. And I don't know. It just doesn't work. And it's an amazing thing. In anticipation of that, because God is our creator, God instituted a waxing and a waning period. So that a husband and wife should look at each other with different eyes at different times of the month, look at each other with a different sense of appreciation, and the marriage should continue in a very beautiful way. It's one of the tools for a successful marriage. When used properly, the marriage continues. When you tell it to a teenager, oh my God, that's horrible. Why would God do such a mean, evil thing? But when you recognize that God put desires into the human not by accident, carefully planned and properly adjusted. And when man uses the system properly, he follows those desires in the right course, in the right time, and they bring him to an attachment, to a bonding. Husband and wife come together, and they have eyes for each other, and they have eyes for no one else. But it requires understanding how the system works. Pleasures are there for a particular reason. Pleasures are good, and pleasures are proper. God created them because God wants us to enjoy our stay on the planet. But you have to know how to be a pleasure seeker. If you don't know the rules of pleasure and you say, let's go. And you pursue pleasure hotly, wherever you can, let's go. You become a slave, not to pleasure, a slave to passion. And this mistake that people make, and they mistake pleasures and passions, is one of the most destructive mistakes people make. You see it in drug addicts, you see it in alcoholics, and you see it in people who destroy their marriages, destroy their happiness. And do not tell me that a person who's looking at other people all day long, lusting with appetites and hungers, is a happy human being. I'm sorry, they are not. But show me a couple who are happily married, who enjoy each other in the right way, in the right time, have a beautiful relationship based on respect, based on mutual affection. Yes, there are limits. The pleasures aren't always, and it's not always, but the human being can have constant pleasure. There are 4 rules to pleasure. There are limits to every pleasure, and every pleasure only has a purpose. But in the context of a proper marriage, they have a union that's beautiful, a union with respect, a union with love. And the physical intimacy, the sexual relationship, serves a very significant purpose. It brings them closer and helps foster that bond of love and keeps it fresh. And is a freshening each month, and each month it renews, and they continue their path in life. It's a very strange thing, this human condition. If a person is willing to learn, is willing to understand what his Creator wants from him, you can lead a beautiful, successful life. But if you decide, listen, I don't care about the instruction manual of the manufacturer, I'm doing things my way, and I'm out there, and I become a pleasure seeker, or just a whatever, who cares? What you're going to find is not much success in life, not much in the ways of accomplishments, and certainly very little happiness. I think if you study the human, you'll find something very, very obvious. God created us in a very exact balance, so that we'll be challenged. Many, many life situations are exact, demanding challenges to us. The human being was created extremely dependent on many, many things, so that he recognizes that he is a creation. The human being was created with limitations, so that he realizes who he is and who he's not. And if you want to know why God didn't make man powerful like a bear, strong and forever, it's because at the end of the day, man is put here for a purpose, to change the essence of himself. And if I were happy as a lark all day and didn't understand why I was here and didn't have a pursuit of meaningful growth, I didn't have a Torah system to allow me to change, to nurture my inner soul, to allow me to work on my character traits, to work on becoming a better giving person, there'd be no reason for existence. But God put the human here for a very particular purpose, and God created the human in a very particular way. God created us in a way that we can grow, we can accomplish, but we will be challenged throughout life. Every pleasure is there for a reason. And yes, they have limits, because the purpose of life isn't pleasure. Pleasures are tools, and pleasures are things to be used, but each of them has a very specific purpose. Each of them is a very specific tool. When used properly, they help the human succeed in his mission in life. When used properly, they help him do what he's here for. When abused, they destroy him. And that is the human condition. And the most strange part about it is that the person who says, I wish to pursue pleasure and nothing but pleasure, is destined to be the most unhappy person. The person who says, I will listen to my Creator's guidebook, and I understand that God is giving, kindly and loving, and I understand that God wants me to enjoy this world, but with a purpose, with a very exact way, and I'm prepared and ready to learn that way, that person accomplishes, grows, and enjoys his stay on the planet.